I want you to picture a shoebox. Not a metaphor. An actual, physical shoebox, sitting in the back of a closet somewhere in Ohio, or Michigan, or wherever your grandparents lived. Inside it, hundreds of photographs. Curled at the edges, slightly yellowed. A wedding, a christening, a kid on a bicycle for the very first time, frozen mid-wobble, 1 foot still touching the ground. On the back of almost every single one of those photos, there's a stamp, a little yellow and red logo, so familiar it barely registers anymore. Kodak. For most of the 20th century, that word wasn't a brand. It was a verb. It was a feeling. Kodak moment. You didn't need to explain what that meant. Everyone just knew. So here's the question I want you to sit with for a second. If I told you that the same company sitting in that shoebox, the company that quite literally taught the world how to remember itself, was also the company that built the world's first digital camera, back in 1975, would you believe me? Because they did. An engineer in a research lab in Rochester, New York, built it with his own hands. A toaster-sized contraption of wires and lenses that could capture an image without a single frame of film. And Kodak buried it. Not because they didn't understand what they had. They understood exactly what they had. That's the tragedy. This isn't a story about a company that failed to see the future. This is a story about a company that saw the future perfectly clearly and chose, deliberately, to look away from it. I've spent weeks going through old patent filings, SEC documents, and interviews with the engineer who built that first camera. And what I found wasn't a story about technology. It was a story about fear. About a 100-year-old empire that got so comfortable, so wealthy, so certain of its own permanence, that it forgot the one rule every empire eventually learns the hard way. Nothing lasts forever, not even the company that sold you your memories. To understand how far Kodak fell, you first have to understand how impossibly high it once stood. The story starts in 1888 with a bank clerk from Rochester named George Eastman. Eastman wasn't a chemist by training, and he wasn't born into money. He was, by most accounts, an obsessive tinkerer, the kind of man who'd spend his evenings coating glass plates with photographic emulsion in his mother's kitchen, because he was convinced photography didn't have to be this miserable, complicated ritual reserved for professionals hauling chemical darkrooms on their backs. And he was right. Eastman's breakthrough wasn't really a camera. It was a philosophy. He rolled photographic emulsion onto flexible film, packaged it into a simple box camera, and sold it with a slogan so confident, it still gives me chills when I read it today. You press the button, we do the rest. Think about how radical that was in 1888. Eastman wasn't selling a machine. He was selling an outsourced relationship with your own memory. You didn't need to know chemistry. Press a button and mail the whole camera back to Rochester. That's not a product. That's a promise. And Rochester believed in that promise more than almost any city in America has ever believed in a single employer. By the 1980s, Kodak's global workforce peaked at roughly 145,000 employees. In Rochester alone, at its height in the early 80s, Kodak employed more people than the region's 3 largest current employers combined. The University of Rochester. Rochester Regional Health. Wegmans. Combined. Think about that for a second. One company. One factory town. An entire regional economy, built on the back of little yellow boxes of film. Kodak didn't just employ Rochester. Kodak was Rochester. It built parks. It funded music programs. It gave employees profit-sharing bonuses that in good years could add weeks of extra salary to a factory worker's paycheck. Families didn't just work at Kodak. Generations worked at Kodak. Grandfather, father, son, all clocking in at the same sprawling campus on State Street, all trusting that the company town would take care of them the way it always had. By the mid-20th century, Kodak controlled somewhere north of 80 to 90% of the American film market, and roughly 90% of camera sales in the US. This wasn't a company competing in a marketplace. This was a company that basically was the marketplace. And here's the part that matters most for where this story is going. Kodak's business model was, in a strange way, almost perfectly designed to print money forever. You didn't buy a camera once. You bought film. Over and over. For the rest of your life. Every birthday. Every vacation. Every Christmas morning. Another roll of film. Another trip to the drugstore for developing. It was the razor and blades model. Except the blades were emotional. People weren't just buying chemicals on plastic strips. They were buying the ability to hold on to time. Which is exactly why what happened next is so hard to reconcile. Because buried inside that same research empire, inside the very labs that had made Kodak the undisputed king of photography, a 24-year-old engineer was about to hand the company the future, and the future would scare them half to death. His name was Steve Sasson. He'd joined Kodak in 1973, fresh out of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, with a master's degree in electrical engineering. And, this detail matters, he wasn't even hired to work on cameras. In 1974, his supervisor, a man named Gareth Lloyd, gave him what was essentially a side project. Almost a keep this kid busy assignment. The task: figure out whether a newly invented sensor, called a charge-coupled device, a CCD, could actually capture an image electronically. No formal review process. No corporate mandate. Nobody was watching. Nobody expected anything to come of it. Sasson spent the better part of a year scavenging parts, literally raiding the labs for spare components, and by December 1975, he had built something that had never existed before, anywhere on Earth. A self-contained digital camera. It weighed about 8 pounds. It took 23 seconds to record a single image. The resulting picture was a grainy, 100 by 100 pixel, black and white grid. It looked like a toaster with a lens bolted onto it. But it worked. In 1976, Sasson walked into a windowless conference room to demonstrate it for Kodak's executives. He photographed people in the room, pulled the cassette tape out of the camera, fed it into a playback device, and a black and white image flickered onto a television screen. According to Sasson, the reaction in that room wasn't excitement. It was something closer to unease. The business and marketing executives asked a very different question. Not how does this work, but why would anyone want to take a picture this way when there's nothing wrong with the way we already do it? Here is the sentence That, to me, is the entire tragedy of Kodak in miniature. Sasson was later told, plainly, by people inside the marketing department, that Kodak could sell a digital camera, but wouldn't, because it would eat into film sales. Read that again. This wasn't a failure of imagination. Kodak's engineers weren't blind to what they'd built. The company patented Sasson's invention in 1978. U.S. Patent 4131919. Electronic still camera. What Kodak lacked wasn't vision. It was the willingness to compete against itself. Because here's the brutal math of it. Kodak's entire empire, the Rochester campus, the 145,000 jobs, the profit-sharing bonuses, the parks, the town, all of it was funded by consumables, by film that got used up, and had to be bought again. A digital camera doesn't need film. A digital camera, if it succeeds, doesn't just create a new product line. It cannibalizes the very foundation the empire was built on. So Kodak did something you see again and again in corporate history, when an incumbent giant is confronted with its own disruption. They didn't destroy the invention. They didn't fire Sasson. They simply slow-walked it. In 1989, Sasson and a colleague even built the first self-contained digital SLR camera. Over a decade before the format would come to dominate the industry, Kodak declined to bring it to market. Again, protecting film. They finally released a consumer digital camera in 1991, 16 years after Sasson's prototype first flickered onto that television screen. 16 years of head start, spent guarding the wagon, instead of building the highway. The 1990s should have been Kodak's moment of reckoning. Instead, they were the decade of denial. George Fisher took over as CEO in 1993, brought in from Motorola, specifically because the board believed Kodak needed an outsider's eye. But Fisher was fighting the company's own DNA. Every dollar redirected toward digital was, internally, treated as a threat to the film division that still generated the overwhelming majority of Kodak's profit. The company was trying to walk two directions at once, protecting yesterday's cash cow while half-heartedly building tomorrow's replacement. And in trying to do both, it did neither particularly well. Then, in 2005, came Antonio Perez, a 25-year veteran of Hewlett-Packard. Under Perez, Kodak made a massive strategic bet, pour hundreds of millions of dollars into building a high-margin inkjet printer business to replace the collapsing film revenue. It was, on paper, a logical pivot. In practice, it meant Kodak was now elbowing its way into a printer market already dominated by HP, Canon, Epson. The bet never paid off at the scale Kodak needed. And the numbers through this period tell a story more brutal than any boardroom quote could. Kodak's stock price collapsed from around $25 a share in 2005 to less than $1 by September 2011. The Rochester workforce, which had peaked at over 60,000 in 1982, had shrunk to roughly 5,100 local employees by the end of 2011. On January 19, 2012, Eastman Kodak, the company that invented the modern snapshot, that built an entire American city around its factories, that literally patented the digital camera, 14 years before anyone else took it seriously, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The filing listed roughly $5.1 billion in assets, against $6.75 billion in debt. Let that sink in for a second. A company that once employed 145,000 people worldwide was, by 2012, worth less than what it owed. Later that year, in a moment so quietly devastating, it barely made headlines outside the business press. Kodak agreed to sell and license its digital imaging patent portfolio, the descendants of Sasson's original patent, for roughly $525 million. The very technology Kodak had suppressed to protect its film business was, in the end, sold off piece by piece, just to keep the lights on, long enough to exit bankruptcy. By the time Kodak emerged from Chapter 11 in 2013, its Rochester workforce had fallen to roughly 2,300 people, its global headcount to 8,800. A company that once employed more people than a small American city now employed fewer people than a single large hospital. I don't think there's a villain twirling a mustache in this story. What destroyed Kodak? There wasn't a single bad decision made in a single boardroom on a single afternoon. It was 30+ years of a company protecting a business model that was already, quietly, dying. Because admitting it was dying would have meant admitting that the future required Kodak to compete against its own most profitable division. That is, I think, the hardest kind of corporate courage there is. Not fighting a rival, fighting yourself. Here's the strange coda to this story. The part almost nobody talks about. Kodak didn't disappear. Not entirely. The company that emerged from bankruptcy in 2013 is a fraction, a ghost, really, of what it once was. In 2022, Kodak announced it was repurposing some of the same high-tech manufacturing equipment once used to produce photographic film to build materials for electric vehicle batteries. Sit with that for a second. The machines that once coated millions of miles of film with light-sensitive chemistry are now being turned toward an entirely different kind of energy revolution. One that, in its own quiet way, echoes the very disruption Kodak once tried to outrun. And Steve Sasson, the engineer who built the thing that started it all, he stayed at Kodak. Not out of stubbornness, out of fascination. He retired from the company in 2009. The same year, in a moment of almost poetic justice, President Barack Obama awarded him the National Medal of Technology and Innovation at the White House. The engineer whose invention the company once shelved because it was too scary was decades later standing in the East Room, being celebrated as one of the most important inventors in American technological history, while the company he built it for was less than 3 years from bankruptcy court. I keep coming back to something Sasson said, reflecting on that very first demonstration back in 1976, that nobody in the room asked him how his invention worked. They only asked why anyone would want it. That question, I think, is the whole story. It's not a question about technology. It's a question about fear, about an empire so convinced of its own permanence that it genuinely could not imagine a world where people wouldn't need it anymore. And maybe that's the real lesson sitting underneath all of this. Every industry, every company, every one of us eventually faces some version of that conference room in 1976. A quiet, unglamorous moment where the future walks in, sets a toaster-sized machine on the table, and shows you exactly what's coming, long before anyone else is ready to admit it. Kodak had the future in its own hands, patented it, owned it, 14 years before anyone else. And then it did the one thing an empire almost never survives. It looked directly at the truth and chose, very deliberately, to keep selling film instead. Somewhere in a shoebox, in the back of a closet, there's still a photograph with that little yellow logo stamped on the back. A perfect, permanent, little Kodak moment. The irony is, the company that taught us how to hold on to a moment couldn't quite figure out how to let go of its own.